Who was that woman? At the beginning of the 20th century, in the small town of Fairview, located in the mountains of North Carolina, there lived a woman named Margaret Hensley. Margaret, widowed since she was young, raised her son Thomas alone. She worked hard as a seamstress, supplying clothes to locals and the town's fabric store. Fairview was a peaceful place, with a small population where everyone knew everyone by name. Life's challenges, especially after her husband's death, had shaped Margaret into a strong and resilient woman. One night, a huge fire destroyed 60% of the region, consuming several houses and establishments. Margaret and Thomas managed to escape unharmed, but lost everything. Homeless, they stayed temporarily at the local church, where residents gathered to help each other. It was a time of great trials, but also of solidarity. In the face of calamity, Margaret maintained hope. She remembered her faith, and that it had accompanied her throughout her life, and sought comfort in prayers. Despite everything, he did not lose confidence that, somehow, everything would be resolved. His biggest concern was securing a future for Thomas, who was just 9 years old at the time. As the city began to rebuild, Margaret made a decision. She would leave for the big city in search of work, hoping to guarantee a better life for herself and her son. He said goodbye to his friends in Fairview and, with few belongings, boarded a train headed for Charlotte. At the station, Thomas held tightly to his mother's hand, uncertain about the future, but confident that she would know what to do. Upon arriving in Charlotte, Margaret quickly found work at a large textile factory. The journey was long and exhausting, but the salary allowed them to rent a small apartment. Margaret dedicated herself body and soul to her work, always motivated by the desire to provide a dignified life for Thomas. She dreamed of the day when he could study and have better opportunities. Life in the city was a constant struggle. Thomas helped his mother after school, making small deliveries around the region. They saved every penny, and Margaret never stopped praying for strength and guidance. Although the difficulties were many, hope remained alive in their hearts. The months turned into years, and Thomas grew up. He became a hardworking and dedicated young man, always inspired by his mother's example. One day, an advertisement in the newspaper caught Margaret's attention. A university offered scholarships to talented students. Margaret saw a unique opportunity for her son and, with effort and dedication, helped Thomas prepare for the exam. With his mother's support and his own determination, Thomas won the scholarship. He began studying law, a field that had always fascinated him. Margaret felt immense pride in seeing her son advance in life, overcoming adversity. During his studies, Thomas stood out and gained an internship at a renowned engineering company, but as part of the legal team. His intelligence and work ethic impressed supervisors, and he was hired shortly after graduating. Life seemed to finally be smiling on Margaret and Thomas. One day, however, a serious accident at work shook their lives. Thomas was working at a hydroelectric plant when an explosion occurred. He was seriously injured and rushed to a hospital. Margaret, upon receiving the news, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. His son, his pride, was between life and death. Upon arriving at the hospital, Margaret was informed that Thomas's condition was critical. Doctors were pessimistic about his chances of survival. Desperate, she knelt there in the hospital corridor, having to be supported by some nurses. And while recovering, she closed her eyes and asked God in the hospital, "God, take me in his place, he's so young." For some time, Margaret remained in prayer, while tears ran down her face. The silence of the chapel was interrupted only by their whispers and sobs. Meanwhile, in the operating room, doctors struggled to save Thomas. Time seemed to drag by, each minute an eternity. Suddenly, Margaret is startled by someone else who was there watching her. At first, she thought it was a relative of someone in the hospital, but soon noticed that the female figure began to approach her. Margaret, very astute, questions her first, "Are you expecting someone?" And then she only receives a faint smile in return, which leaves Margaret confused and worried. Then that woman says, "Don't be afraid. I came to help you in your prayer, can I?" Margaret, still suspicious, answers yes, but due to despair and fear of losing her son, she soon gives in to tears again. The woman next to her kneels in front of the chapel and, without thinking twice, Margaret does the same. After a few minutes, Margaret feels the urge to express gratitude to the woman who joined her prayer and, still with her eyes closed, simply thanks her for her support, speaking in a low voice. The strange figure, at his side, says, "Don't worry, your faith will bring you back." A few seconds later, Margaret is startled by the voice of a nurse who appears looking for her, and upon finding her kneeling in the chapel, the nurse apologizes for the inconvenience and says she needs to say something. Margaret then gets up and turns her head around, seeming to look for something, until the nurse questions her. "Are you feeling something? Everything is fine? What are you looking for?" And confused Margaret responds, "Where did that woman who was here next to me praying with me go?" The nurse, without thinking twice, states, "But there was no one here, and the chapel is at the end of the corridor. I would have seen that woman if she had passed by me." But before Margaret can conclude any reasoning, the nurse soon declares the reason why she was looking for her. Quite simply, Thomas was awake and had good vital signs, contrary to doctors' previous expectations. Margaret is startled and, accompanied by the nurse, hurriedly leaves where she was to find Thomas. Unable to do so for security reasons, Margaret is just content with the unexpected news. 20 days later, Thomas was able to receive visitors and was about to be discharged and go home. Although Thomas had to have a care routine, his progress was undeniable. Doctors called his recovery miraculous, and many believed it was indeed divine intervention. Due to so many events, Margaret had forgotten the strangest moment of that entire desperate day. The mysterious woman who helped her in prayer and suddenly left the room without anyone seeing her. Margaret, when sharing this event with her son, was amazed to hear what he had to say. "Mother, before I opened my eyes in the operating room, a woman who I thought was a doctor approached me and said that I should go back, as I would still live for many years. And then she turned and left the room. I'm sure of what I saw, but I only opened my eyes the moment she left the room." Surprised, Margaret understands what had happened. That woman beside him in the chapel could only be an angel sent by God, the same angel who brought the miracle that day. Margaret always said that faith in Jesus was the greatest gift anyone could have. And she had proof of this, being contemplated by an angel who brought a miracle into her life and the life of her dear Thomas. The story that saved Thomas was passed on to friends, neighbors, and church members, not only as a testimony to the power of prayer, but also as a reminder of the importance of sincere faith. The small town of Fairview, where they lived, was reclaimed, and years later they returned to live there and prospered there. The lives of Margaret and Thomas were marked forever, as being the reference and reward for being and wanting good. According to themselves, having Jesus as a basis and inspiration is living as if he were immortal and never being alone.